I love how everyone got quiet immediately just because I'm standing here. We're good? Okay. So hello, good evening. My name is Kim Crosby. I'm the interim director of the Harris Center, and it's great to see you all here for this evening. I'm going to start with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Othig, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. A few housekeeping items. Of course, there is some tea and coffee outside. You're welcome to get that during the event this evening. Should you need washrooms, they are back out through the doors, down to your right, and weave around, continuing to the right. And there are signs up on the walls for those. In the event there is an alarm and we need to leave the building, we'll simply go to the stairs on the left-hand side when we exit, or go back the way you came, which again is turning right. And there's a muster station on the parking lot. Tonight's event and the panel discussion is being live streamed and it's being recorded. So it will be a moderated discussion. So please hold your questions until the end. And also make sure you have a microphone before speaking. And this is so that everyone watching online this evening can hear the questions and what we're saying. The microphones won't pick it up otherwise. So it is my pleasure to officially welcome you all to today's discussion on media and democracy, the rising pressures of capacity, competition, and trust. I'm going to turn it over to Boyan first. He is the Center's Manager of Knowledge Mobilization, and he is going to introduce our STEAM panel and then moderate the rest of the discussion. So welcome.
Hey folks, I'll stop squinting in about 7 minutes when the sun moves beyond that cut in the curtain. My name is Brian Pierce. I'm Manager of Knowledge Mobilization. I'll be moderator for the discussion today. And my panelists are Alex Bill, the editor of Newfoundland and Labrador, a daily business and politics publication with 7 reporters in St. John's and more than 40 reporters across its sister publications in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Alex is a lawyer by trade and joined the company as a reporter in 2015 and became an editor in 2019. Ashley Fitzpatrick is a staff writer with Atlantic Business Magazine in St. John's. She's a graduate of Memorial's Bachelor of Arts program, also earning a diploma in performance and communications media. She went on to earn a Bachelor of Journalism from the University of King's College, Halifax. In addition to her current magazine work over the past 15 years, she has completed work as a journalist for outlets including but not limited to Newfoundland and Labrador, CBC, The Independent, and The Telegraph. And last but not least, Anthony Germain is an award-winning journalist who has worked with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation for more than 30 years. He hosted the St. John's Morning Show, CBC TV's Here and Now, and most recently the #1 provincial afternoon radio show On the Go. Before moving to St. John's, Anthony was a foreign correspondent who spent 5 years in China, based in both Beijing and Shanghai. He also worked on Parliament Hill, covering national politics as both a reporter and host of the House on CBC Radio. Anthony will be leaving CBC in a few days, March 31st, and rumor has it there might be a new adventure in teaching down the road. So that's the panel. We all know the old story, right? That's why we all got into journalism. The journalists are the bedrock of democracy, either as muckrakers and investigative reporters, or there to amuse us and to report on local stories. We've all seen movies. We've seen The Spotlight, All the President's Men, Apocalypse Now. I was hoping Dave House would be here because he still embodies the David Hopper character in that movie. But that story doesn't hold anymore. So, Anthony, what happened?
What happened? Is there an on switch on these, or is
there is an on switch on the... Yeah, there we go.
I used to know how to use a microphone. What happened? I think of all those things you mentioned, with all the President's Men, I think there's a the same way there was a sort of an influx into archaeology programs after Indiana Jones. In my era, All the President's Men, I mean, it had a huge impact, as did Mary Tyler Moore, Murphy Brown. These shows kind of glamorized journalism. And the idea was, back in the old days, that we really were entering a field where what we did for a living really mattered to democracy. Carl Bernstein, who I think was my favorite of the duo because college dropout, mouthy, in-your-face kind of guy. And his notion of trying to find the best obtainable version of the truth, to me, was a great way to describe what it is that I think journalists do when they're doing their best work. But it's very difficult now to find a best obtainable version of the truth when so many people can't agree on what a fact is. I think 30 years ago, when there were facts, they were facts. And political opponents were opponents or adversaries, but they weren't enemies. So there's two things that I think have happened. There's a polarization that we've all seen. And I also think that in 2007, everything changed with the invention of the iPhone. I don't have any data to back this up, but I think because of subscription rates and smartphones, there's been a psychological change in people's minds where they think they can get all the information they want. And when I say they want, I mean they don't need a gatekeeper like him or me or her to tell them what they should want. So that's what's changed. People want to get the information on their own. And worst of all, for organizations that expect results, they don't want to pay for it, right? The data is pretty clear. Fewer than 15% of Canadians subscribe or want to pay a subscription. I think right now it's around 11 or 12%. You take that with the collapse of advertising and you've got a double whammy. Nobody wants to pay, advertisers don't want to pay. And so right now, journalism faces a crisis.
Okay, that's a good start. I want to come back to something you just said, but I want to ask Ashley about the other aspect of that. And we were joking that I can't even bring myself to say something funny about local news because it's just so depressing listening to the stories. What's happening with local news?
There's a whole lot. I think the biggest thing is that everybody is aware what's happening right now is an extension of something that's been happening for quite a while now. Just to give you an idea, when I entered journalism, I was in journalism school, my graduating class, a lot of the members covered the closure of the Daily News in Halifax by Transcontinental. So that would have been around 2007, 2008. And our head of the journalism school told all of us not to expect a job in the news, that reporting jobs were disappearing and that was going to be a rarity in our world in the future. When I left journalism school, I knew that the whole purpose for me was going to be to report for friends, family, communities back home. I wanted to get back to Newfoundland and Labrador, so I took the very first job that was available on the island. And that was at the Western Star in what was their quote unquote Deer Lake Bureau. So it was an office on the main street of Deer Lake that started out with me working with one other person who was very quickly laid off. That office was the remnant of what used to be an entire standalone paper called the Humber Log that had been absorbed by the Star and disappeared. So again, an extension of those ongoing amalgamations and losses, even then. When I left, that office was lost. It was gotten rid of in a few years. And then the Western Star, which was a daily newspaper, became weekly and online only, and then part of a regional wire service absorbed under Saltwire. Saltwire, as we all know right now, is the company that also owns the Telegram. The weekly newspapers that used to exist all around the province have disappeared. It wasn't just ones that I knew of in my area when I was in Deer Lake. And now we have the risk to the Telegram and the question of what's going to happen at that, capital city newspaper, that only newspaper that really exists in the province right now. And I think everybody's waiting for April 25th. I want to say is the date. I was just reading up on the latest from Aaron Beswick, who is a local news reporter himself, works in Nova Scotia. Aaron's a great reporter. And he had written the latest on the saltwater sale. The sale has been approved, the process has been approved, and April 25th is when we're gonna know basically if anybody's throwing their hat in the ring and who's going to become potentially a buyer of the Telegram and other newspapers under the saltwater chain. So right now, the only thing I would say is that local news is challenged. Is maybe the fun way to put it, if you want to have a fun way to put it. No, the reality is that we've seen massive erosion of, and people shouldn't think about it as just businesses. They should think about it as essentially the infrastructure, the people, the human infrastructure that helps us to engage with topics, to find consensus, to open up debates. The people who went out finding details about issues of concern for the communities, or even letting us know in other parts of the province what's happening, not too far down the road. Those people have lost jobs and they've moved to other places, and now we have huge news deserts that are a real problem, because that's where, when Anthony's talking about, I think some of the more toxic elements, maybe I would say, or certainly the fighting over even what is a fact. I think that some of that starts to germinate in places where we don't have, frankly, people who are paid to go out and verify and at least attempt in a very formalized fashion to figure out what might be truth and what might be total folly. And at least that's a starting point.
I think there is a connection between these two things that I also want to kind of poke a little bit at. But let's go to you, Alex. You are now de facto one of the largest newsrooms in the province. But your model is very different in terms of how you sustain all Newfoundland and Labrador. There is sort of an element of exclusivity to it. How do you kind of balance those things, the model that you need in order to survive? And do you still feel that sort of push to be the watchdog, the muckraker?
Certainly, I feel that push because, if you're generating a product and the whole idea is that people have to pay for it, then you're kind of forced to do that all the more. I'd like to quickly respond to what Ashley and Anthony said, though, because it feels like there was two issues raised, an economic one, which we could probably talk about solutions to and ways to address, and cultural one. And the cultural one is a more depressing conversation, both that polarization and this relatively recent idea that people just don't want to pay for news anymore. So our publication, All Newfoundland and Labrador, and our sister publications in Nova Scotia and other provinces are premised upon the idea that there still are people who will pay and that good news is worth paying for. And this model also assumes that our competition is not just other news media, but media generally. So we don't share any of our content over social media. We disable screenshots on mobile and desktop. And I had a subscriber tell me once that some friends put him onto it and described it as a secret news website to him, which is not the vibes that we are going for, but it was funny at the time. Obviously, asking for $13 a month, which is what most subscribers pay, is something that you can do for business news that you probably can't do for sports or for arts. So it's not a model everybody can do, and I don't think any one model is going to work for everybody. But the question you answered about what do I feel pressure to strike a balance, and the answer is no. It's not for us to strike the balance of accessibility and quality. We just provide the best work that we can do and hope that other people elsewhere can find other ways to do so as well, and to find different models and different markets to tap into. I think fragmentation, which is going to come up a lot today, isn't going anywhere and isn't something that we can mitigate and change. We have to address it, I think, by learning to adapt.
So the old story doesn't work anymore, and it probably never did. You refer to this glamorization of journalism, and of course, nowhere is that more obvious than in Peter Parker, Clark Kent, right? They really took it to a whole other level. So we need a new relationship between media and democracy, maybe. We have fragmentation of audiences, we have the collapse of local news, for the lack of a better word. What is that new relationship? What are we looking at? Maybe, I don't know.
Well, I mean, the one thing that sort of goes along with all of this is the verifiable decline in trust in the media, which is associated with the polarization that we talked about. And I think 2016, a certain person was elected in the United States. And I think that I don't think there's any question that has trickled over into this country. And I don't have a solution for how we actually start rebuilding trust with the public, with the media writ large. If people are suspicious of the media, and there is data to back this up, and I think right now the latest trust figures for people who are polled, and there's Oxford College and the Reuters Institute did a major survey of a whole bunch of countries, including Canada. And I think the percentage of people who will say, I trust the media, so that would be him, me, her, is 42%. 15 years ago, it was 58%. So when you get data like that, sort of think, okay, well, what we need to do is try to find ways to rebuild that trust. And I'm not sure that turning local newspapers into ghost papers and having 1,300 people laid off, at Bell, layoffs this year at CBC, I'm not sure how that's going to rebuild trust, because as Ashley pointed out, if you don't have that lifeblood of reporters to go out and verify those facts, then you can't do the real journalism, which is not the facts, but explaining the context around those facts. That's where the fun is, right? I mean, a lot of people can establish the facts. A good lawyer can establish the facts, but the actual journalism is in explaining the context. And I think what we all try to do, and one of my favorite definitions of journalism, is to provide information that helps people make better decisions in their lives. And that's getting more difficult to do. So I don't know the magic solution. I think perhaps better civics in education would help. And we haven't even touched on what social media has done to the media landscape, right? But the way everything is fractured, it's going to be very difficult. Now, this is not all pessimism, because when I graduated, which was, the Bible was a flyer, the same thing I had was you never get a job. There are no jobs. It was during a recession. Advertising was down. So I like to think that we are pretty close to hitting rock bottom, and that somehow models like a subscription model and more niche news organizations. There's only so much room for New York Times and BBC and these incredible news organizations. But maybe the future is going to consist of media outlets like Alex's, that are going to concentrate on sports, on economics, on maritime affairs, on whatever it is. So maybe we're looking at a future where, hey, I'm one of 50,000 subscribers to this media, which only reports on environmental issues, but not just any environmental issue, but the emissions from ships. There's going to be a lot of niches, I suspect.
So, Alex, maybe a question for you, because you kind of operate almost a niche publication here. The audience has fragmented, and that kind of drag the whole business model down. But I think there is kind of like I don't know, maybe it's the cultural geographer in me comes out. But we also lack a common story now. We used to be that, 7 million Americans received Life magazine. That was the common story that played across households, right? In many ways, the same held for Canada. So what happens when we don't have that common story? When I subscribe to 5 Substacks and 3 podcasts and maybe Alex's publication, but I don't have anything in common with Ashley because she subscribes to a completely different set of stories.
Yeah, we probably suffer to continue to understand each other. And I think a lot of these issues that we're talking about are actually much broader than news media. People trust media less, but they trust everything less. They trust each other less. They trust government less. And, that those are such confounding problems that, they may be beyond answering. But I agree that one of the ways that media is probably going to have to respond is to try and move away from the one-stop shop model and speak to the people who want to listen to specifically what you are saying. And if more people do that successfully, then maybe we can hopefully get people operating within the realm of fact again, and not these increasingly fragmented ideas of what truth is. But yeah, it's a challenge.
Ashley, what does the future hold?
Well, I think one of the big things I would like to say is that there's a huge difference between individual reporters who are individual people and news organizations and outlets that are businesses. A lot of people tend to conflate, if there's an editorial in the Telegram, then all of the reporters of the Telegram feel that way, and how dare they feel that way, and I'm gonna tell so-and-so exactly what I think of their opinion, which they quite likely don't even hold. And I think that's a huge piece of it, is to say, like, we root for things like the survival of the Telegram, but given the way things have gone in media, there's not a universal expectation that that paper is going to survive. In fact, I've been saying for years, it would not shock me if we had no newspapers in Newfoundland and Labrador. That wouldn't be something that kept me awake at night, because frankly, I expect at some point it's going to happen. And that is really difficult for somebody who's spent, at least half a career already, in newspapers, and thinking about the importance of media that does have that kind of universal reach, or attempt at universal reach to the communities. And I think mainly because as much as we talk about new media and the opportunities in new media, particularly in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I do want to emphasize the difference here to other provinces, a lot of times this conversation happens at the national level, and they have no concept of really what's happening outside of the Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal corridor. Even if you're in Halifax, the number of people working in media who are not just reporters, but people who support those reporters, who provide them employment, is massively different from what's here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And what's here in St. John's is dramatically different from what you have in Western Newfoundland or on the Northern Peninsula. I think, I don't know if she'd be okay with me throwing her name out, but Layla Baudouin right now, shout out to Layla, used to work with NTV. She's doing a lot of freelance these days. She's based in Port Saunders, as far as I know right now. She may be the only person, for me anyway, that comes to mind working on the Northern Peninsula, period. There's one person. So if something happens, people are really, if a bridge collapse, it's not going to be Baltimore, but if something dramatic, if that whole highway gets washed out, there's one person who's going to be in any sort of proximity to respond to that in less than half a day. Right. And to me, that's the kind of thing that, there are things that are going to be universally of interest to the community, no matter what your personal particular interests are. And then separate from that, I think we need to start thinking about the fact that with startups, all Newfoundland and Labrador is an exception. It is very much an exception. And as far as I know, it's really the only startup that's surviving here. Rec House Weekly got a huge acclaim nationally when they did fantastic reporting after Hurricane Fiona. And they've stepped away from local news. They're focusing on their publishing business, and fair enough for them. It's decisions that had to be made. But I think we should all recognize that decisions like that are happening in part because we're not supporting this idea that there can be community hubs, there can be outlets that serve multiple sets of interests, but more importantly, things that are of general interest to the community. And when we talk about these niche outlets, we also need to remember the idea of having a society whereby only a small subset of people are aware of the information that is important and relevant to the conversation, relevant to everybody. And when you look at all Newfoundland and Labrador, I've worked there, I know the model, and I'm a huge fan of it. I think that they're doing great work, some of the best reporting that's happening in the province. But it is a reality that only a very small subset of our society is accessing that news and information. And sometimes it reaches the House of Assembly, and therefore everybody else kind of picks up on it. And sometimes it gets leaked out to some other outlets and they chase their stories. But the work that those reporters are doing is exclusive to those subscribers. So the majority of the information that they're producing doesn't reach the rest of society. And yes, it's fragmentation. And yes, I think that there won't be any universal answer, but I think it should be something that we try and tackle in a meaningful way. however that might happen.
There was a fishing trip that got picked up though, that I think you managed to. But I just want to, there's something important that Ashley touched on that, I got a call from a judge, which you never get. And this judge wanted to know why we missed a story which happened north of Rocky Harbor, south of St. Anthony. And the story was a man had been arrested and they found a certain amount of cocaine in his possession and $175,000 US in cash. No reporters, no story. And the Americans have done a lot of research on this, and there is a correlation in polls, and I don't think there's a reason to think it's any different, where local newspapers have died, voter turnout goes down, and there's a lot of evidence that local corruption goes up, especially with, I think, the lifeblood of a lot of coverage is municipal politics. And the city beats, the town beats, town hall, city hall, when news organizations start cutting back in those institutions, and those institutions are pretty close to people, right? I mean, Parliament's there, House of Assembly's here, but City Hall, God damn it, my pothole, that's kind of, it's a different level of politics, right? And one of the studies that I read, a great example, was a city in California called Bell. And it's not a gigantic city, it's not a rich city. They got rid of their last newspaper. And within 5 years of that, the police chief was given a raise, his salary was $575,000. And I think the mayor was getting $787,000. They used to have a municipal reporter. So to your point, when we leave these places uncovered, Northern Peninsula is not easy to cover, neither is the Burin Peninsula. Labrador, I don't want to swear, but stuff happens.
So you mentioned that 15% of people are willing to pay for a subscription, right? To news.
On a good day.
On a good day.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, nobody's going to give up their Netflix subscription for news subscription, right? The interesting part to me is that part of my job is to facilitate community conversations, sometimes 60, 70 people all around the province. And we talk about regional priorities and how they envision their community in 5 years. And one thing inevitably comes up now is the lack of local news. So they will somebody always brings it up. It says, I don't know what's happening in my community. Never mind what's happening in the neighboring community. So how do we reconcile those two things? People are not willing to pay for local news, but at the same time are obviously seeing this massive gap in what makes the region a region because they don't have the information about each other. So how do we bridge that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know if there is an answer. Certainly broad, equally applicable economic incentives like the labor tax credit are fair, and you could say apolitical, but the government that brings them in gets cast as the one that all the media are going to be in the bag for. Beyond that, it's kind of like daycare, people don't want to pay for it, they desperately want it, and we're not paying the people who work in that industry enough. It is an economic paradox, and that's what local media, especially in rural markets, is facing as well.
I'm going to throw out a couple of ideas on that.
Go for it.
Because I think that we do need to start getting real and getting past this,
Yes.
like, oh gosh, news. I think there's some really practical things we could start with and then see what ideas might come up next. And some of those would be things like, number one, if the government is pushing out money for news, very much link that to news deserts, link that to areas where you have startups that have maybe 1 or 2 employees that are poised for growth. If you have an all Newfoundland and Labrador, be willing to give them the money, but only willing to give them the money if they place a reporter on the other side of the province. Be very specific and targeted with how you're supporting news. I was definitely one of those people when the initial federal funding for journalism came out. I was not happy with it because I didn't think that there should be huge sums of money going to the Globe and Mail, to the Toronto Star, if they weren't doing the work of supporting rural and remote reporting, of addressing news deserts, of serving underserved communities. And yes, there was sort of labels put it on it after the fact, but initially, if you didn't have 2 employees, 3 employees, I forget the exact number, but they weren't going to give you any cash, even if you were a really promising startup. For anybody who doesn't know, the Independent in Newfoundland and Labrador wouldn't have qualified for the cash initially based on the fact that it doesn't have full-time employees, didn't have time, I think had only one full-time employee at the time, I think. But certainly wouldn't have qualified. So I think we can be targeted in funding. And I also think that people need to be aware that because of the situation we have, there will be more reliance on social media and individual sort of information seekers in the community. So it really is worth pushing governments to engage with that idea by way of proactive disclosure of information. And by that, I mean, if you're going to have individuals trying to fill the holes that used to be served by reporters who were paid full time to go information hunting, there's no special qualifications for a reporter. We learn certain skills in journalism school, but fundamentally, it's people paid and given the time to seek out information. That's a huge piece of the job. And so if you're not going to have people paid to do that, you're going to be relying on sort of folks who are out there trying to, grit through it. We should be pushing governments to proactively put more information online, make it easily digestible and accessible, and at least provide the basis for conversations to begin. So by that, I mean, it's a given that when government goes traveling around the world, people are going to say, oh, look at them spending that money. How much do they spend on that? Every single trip that's taken internationally by the provincial government should require all receipts to be posted online, period. That shouldn't be the kind of thing that you have to file an access to information request for and wonder if you're going to get it back in 30 days and maybe not like the response you get, so you have to go fight it. And maybe that takes up half a year. We want to know what you're spending on your travel. That's an easy one. And there's 1,000 topics like that if you got a group of people together, you could really get some movement on.
Alex, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd just like to address this idea of targeting because I certainly agree that we can't have incentives that just get sucked up by Bell or Post Media. We need supports that will be equally applicable to the Independent, to the Northeast Avalon Times or the Shoreline. But, one of the kind of issues we face, and Anthony touched on it initially, was trust. And, I'm concerned that the more we attach conditions, target incentives, or, make things different, that we just risk eroding that trust further and allowing people to take shots and politicize the issue. And so for sure, ideally, we could best put this money towards where it's most needed, this money being whatever incentives we come up with. But I think there are big risks that come with that too.
I mean, you know what I don't trust? I don't trust a news outlet who's telling me what's happening in my backyard, who's filing a report out of Halifax. And that happened when we had the protests on Confederation Building, and Global News had a reporter in Halifax do that story with tape that was shipped from some magical place. Maybe they had a shooter freelance here for them. I don't know, but they have no reporter based here as far as I'm aware of. Globe and Mail has no reporter here. New York Times has no reporter here. So the one thing I would trust is people putting investment into having people at scenes, having people look at issues who are in the communities where those issues are focused, and report from there. And that's, to me, a starting point for trust.
There is an interesting bill before Congress, this Tenny Delbane bill, which is supported by a good number of Republicans and Democrats. And it kind of touches on what you said. I got some concerns with it, but at least it's an effort. And what they do is they specify the bill specifies if you are a medium or small size news organization, and it's all focused on print, really, print and digital, then you can qualify for a $5,000 tax break for the startup, and you will get a certain tax break for each reporter that you hire. So the Americans are looking at this because they've seen, I think in the United States in the last 6 years, I think 2,000 papers have gone under. And it's these community papers, which, it's one thing to have a Globe and Mail or a National Post or even an Ottawa Citizen. But those small papers that tell you all about your local candidates when it's time to get elected, or why did they sell the airport, those kinds of things, that's going to be lost, right? Without that there. And you started off talking about all the president's men. I mean, their motto is what? Democracy dies in darkness, right? That came out coincidentally the year after Trump was elected. People think, it goes back to the 1800s, but it doesn't. It's new. And they took a lot of ribbing about that. But I think that's actually what we're talking about here. There's not a lot of light. One bright spot in this province in particular is television. And it's not just Newfoundland and Labrador, but in Canada, television news is still a major source of news. I think 40% of Canadian states, their number one source. Now that's still doing this. And most of those viewers are much older. But there is a hope, you know, if you're talking about how we're going to connect people, because it's not all print. Spent a lot of time talking about newspapers for some reason. But local radio is a force, but again, it's doing this. But there may be a potential for, and I hope that Saltwire keeps things, the last thing this place needs is for there not to be a telegram. The last thing the CBC needs is for there not to be a telegram or a VOCM. I think we need that competition. Now, Halifax, I mean, if you brought it up as fair for this, it's a totally different scene there. There are a few, I wouldn't say bright lights, but lights.
Anthony, this is going to be utterly unfair, but I got to ask. CBC. What is the role of the public news broadcaster in kind of reshaping that relationship between media and democracy?
So I am not here speaking for the CBC.
Right,
So let's
that's
make
why I
that.
said it's unfair here.
But seeing how my time is limited, I can speak frankly. I think the role for the public broadcaster is difficult in this country because on the one hand, there was a model where if there was the financial resources so that the CBC did not have to seek any advertising. So like radio, so television and online. One of the controversial areas with 36 stations across the country is the CBC was never intended to produce little websites in 36 markets to compete against newspapers. And that's just a fact. The CBC, the legislation governing the CBC hasn't been reviewed by Parliament in a quarter century. Do Canadians still want a CBC? There's certainly the next person to be Prime Minister has made his position on the CBC very clear. But I still think, particularly for certain regions of the country, and I think Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are more sensitive to this, it's a big country. And Labrador would have very little coverage. The entire north, all the territories would have very little coverage. A lot of rural Canada wouldn't have. So perhaps, given the nature of media presence in big cities where the private market can actually turn a buck, maybe the public broadcaster's emphasis should not be in the St. John's, the Montreals, the Ottawas, the Torontos. Maybe a new mandate should say, listen, Canada is bigger than the broadcast center in Toronto. Which apparently Mr. Poilievre is going to turn into a shelter for homeless people, I think is what he said, so.
Oh, but shit. Yeah, that sounds like a brilliant.
I'd like to ask Alex, because it seems like a waste of the best real estate in downtown. Has to be other option.
Alex, I was going to ask you, because you work across Atlantic Canada, is there something different about Newfoundland and Labrador?
For us, there is, yeah. Covering business and politics, and working in the province that probably has the most government influence in its economy of every province of Canada. You simply can't separate the two very much. Our newest publications in Alberta and Saskatchewan are not that keen on covering politics in those provinces right now. They really focus on business, and that was never an option for us here. And certainly the landscape changes province to province. There's much less competition in news media here than in Nova Scotia. There might be more than there is in Saskatchewan. So it's different here. I think, I think compared to other provinces, there might be even a little bit more public engagement and trust. Certainly that fact of a bigger government presence in life means it's all the more important, as Ashley was speaking to earlier, to have transparency, to have proactive disclosure. And while that can always be better, it's actually worse in a lot of other provinces than it is here. So those are some of the differences, yeah.
I'm aware I'm talking to three journalists. Do you have questions for each other maybe at this point?
Yeah, I guess I have one for Anthony, because I thought that conversation about the CBC was really interesting. And, I've always felt that the CBC's role was to fill in and cover what other news media weren't covering, couldn't cover. And, but for a long time, there's been a push towards the opposite direction of regionalizing management and, from St. John's to Halifax, from Halifax to Toronto. It's been moving that way and not the other. And there's so much politics in the conversation about the CBC right now, and so much is going to be out of management's hands and out of reporters' hands. But is there anything that the CBC can do to save itself.
So the assumption there is that CBC is doomed.
One could argue that it might need saving.
One could argue many things, Alex. I think I think there was a recognition by the upper leadership, and again, I don't speak for the CBC, that accusations that the public broadcaster has stopped concentrating on a lot of stories that interest Canadians because the allegation of various different agendas to be more activist than journalistic. I think there's a sense that the pendulum has swung in a certain direction and that it ought to move back to a place where taxpayers believe they're getting value. That's a majority. That's not to say we don't cover the issues of injustice to minorities, whether that's trans people or people of color or equity-seeking communities, because I think that's important. I think our job as journalists is to cover injustice. But I think there is a sense, and I think Mr. Poilievre has capitalized on this, that, and I think it's true for a lot of news organizations, we're out of touch with too many people. We, as a profession, are very comfy with the bourgeoisie. We're not very good at covering the working class, or what we used to call the working class. We might deign to cover the people we perceive as to be low income, or God forbid, we call them poor. Maybe we're better at that, but in terms of people who earn, say, between $20,000 and $43,000 a year, I think we're elitist. And there needs to be a greater sense that there are working people out there. They've got stories to tell. They've got issues that aren't always brought to the government's attention. And thrown into all of this, we saw recently W5, an investigative program, mothballed. I think we could spend a whole day talking about it, but who's going to do investigative journalism in this country? Because investigative journalism, both knows, expensive, takes time. And if people don't want to pay for digital news, how are we going to pay for the investigative stuff? Because that's the stuff that ends up on the floor of the House of Commons. That's the stuff that changes laws and regulations. That's the stuff that exposes environmental crimes that make people sick. That's my biggest concern individually, is about our capacity to do investigative journalism. But for the overall relevance of the public broadcaster, I think Radio Canada, the French wing of the CBC, covers foreign affairs, covers business, covers the core, and they cover the same sort of injustice stories that we cover. But I think they might have a better sense of what it is their audience wants.
I still bristle that I have to listen to BBCs from our own correspondents instead to a Canadian. International news.
You don't like the BBC? You don't like the BBC?
I do, but why do I have to listen to BBC? I
No,
know.
I came from a different point of view. Because, for example, the Queen's funeral.
Right.
We spent a fortune. I think we spent every show, like all the major shows all went. Why wouldn't we call the BBC? Here's $100,000. We'll take your feed. I mean, who's going to cover the Queen's funeral better than the BBC?
Right.
So some decisions, a lot of people saying, if we hadn't done that, we would do this. We could cover St. Anthony for a fraction.
I still think
It's
there
a good thing I'm
is.
retiring because I get fired by it.
No, I still think there is value in having Anthony Germain invasion.
That's very kind.
What do you think about CBC covering the Olympics then?
That's a different thing, because it's very, very expensive. But I don't trust any American network or any other network to let you know that this swimmer from Gander got a silver. So I think that actually is within the mandate. And when it's held at home even, it's hard to turn a profit on the games, Although it's getting better thanks to digital, believe it or not. Those little Canadian Tire ads that come up, they pay for a lot. They don't cover the costs, but I really think in terms of the mandate, Canadians want to know how their athletes are doing. And I don't think any other media organization is going to do it. Whether we need to do it wall to wall, I don't know. I was hoping to stay until Paris because the games were an option. And everybody was competing for one venue. And that was surfing, because it's actually happening in Fiji, which is a 1-2 day event on a beach. But I decided to leave early. A big mistake.
What was that you were saying about being elite?
Surfing is a sport for everyone.
Listen, we have a lot of students here in the room today because this is part of their class. I'm curious, I graduated from journalism school in 2000. what it taught me probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense now. Inverted pyramid probably doesn't really hold water anymore. One of my greatest experiences working as a journalist was actually working as a freelancer from Croatia for CBC and working with the producers at Dispatches, because that was amazing. And I asked a good friend of mine who at that time worked at CBC, like, this was an incredible experience. What happened? And he said, well, when you become a producer of ideas, Dispatches, Sunday Edition, there's nowhere for you to go. Your job is to teach. And they did. And I learned more creating two segments for Dispatches than I did in 4 years of broadcasting classes. So what are we supposed to be teaching this generation of journalists, or whatever journalism looks like in the future?
Thanks.
Go for it.
I'm actually going to begin, and I'm picking up my book because I don't want to get the reference wrong. Cecil Rosner, in case anybody doesn't know, he spent 40 years already, he's still going, in journalism in Canada. He's got a book called Manipulating the Message. It just came out not too long ago. But he included a Statistics Canada note here, and he says there are fewer than 12,000 reporters in Canada compared to nearly 160,000 employees in the advertising, public relations, and communications industry. And I want to throw that out because that's only the people who, for Statistics Canada purposes, would identify themselves as working within those industries. That's not even accounting the folks who do other things that happen to do communications as half of their work, and maybe just don't think to put it on their surveys. And starting there is the reason I wanted to do that is because I want to say the biggest thing is going to be trying to manage all of the quote unquote information that's coming at you. And some of it will be good. Some folks who work in communications are fantastic, and they do a really good job at genuinely and honestly trying to bring forth stories to the media, to a broader set of attention. And part of that is related to losses in the media. You know, if you look at some of the things that they're done even through the university, I mean, the Gazette is a really interesting read if you get a chance to pick it up now and then, and can at least get you started on maybe looking into a subject of interest. But as a reporter or as somebody who's interested in going into this field, just be very cognizant of the fact that whatever you believe or whatever you're given as the story to begin with, you're going to have to do some legwork and some digging, and be very conscious of the fact that there's a good chance that that's not the whole story, or not maybe the angle that's most appropriate, or the thing that's going to be most on point and relevant to the community, to your audience, to the people that you've sort of dedicated yourself to serve. And by that, I mean, it's a very individual choice. You know, whoever you're working for, at some point as an individual, you are going to make some decisions on who you're working for, who that work effort is actually really tailored towards. And every outlet will have its own kind of audience, but you as an individual person, as an individual worker, are certainly going to have to make some choices on, you know, how deep you're going to go, how detailed you're going to get, what you're going to choose and not choose to spend your time on. And we all know that that was an issue before we really got into the worst of the journalism crisis that we're in now. It's even more of an issue and a consideration today.
I never studied journalism, so I don't really know the answer, but this probably biases what I'm going to say, but I would start by saying go out and do something else. And that's not a pessimistic thing, but I think a lot of journalists will benefit from just coming into it with a bit more life experience. If you go straight through school, fair enough, that's, you know, choice you want to do. You're gonna have a large learning curve, but, you know, go out and work in a factory, go out and travel and do some shit job somewhere and gain a little life experience. Because, you know, I didn't learn the inverted pyramid in school. Somebody told me that one day. And the other things I've picked up in life have helped me more in this line of work. And, you know, life and journalism is kind of plinko, you know, it's going to take a bit of luck and chance to find the right opportunity, and the more broad life experience you have going into it, probably the better it'll serve you.
So I teach a couple of journalism courses at the College of North Atlantic, and enrollment in journalism schools across Canada is not plummeting, but it's declining in a pretty fast way. And it's not just because of this crisis. I mean, young people come out of high school or whatever other degree they decide to do. They see Bell's laying off people, the CBC's laying off people. They're watching this really depressing panel from Munn. They say, why would I go into this field, right? So it's probably a good thing that fewer people want to enter this field right now, because there are a lot of unemployed journalists in this country. But one of the things that does give me hope is that there are still young people who are hungry to hit the pavement and report the stories and monitor sources of power and speak truth to power. So that is an optimistic thing that I see when I see these new students who show up every year. I do fear that there's almost ethical obligation on my part to say, you know what, the pay's gone down, the jobs aren't the same. You're going to have to do 5 times as much work as I did. And because like for the CBC, you got to file for TV, radio, and online. If depth is what you want to do, go work for him, right? Because it's going to get harder and harder for people to really do that. And to Alex's point, and back to Mr. Bernstein, who dropped out of college, I mean, he's of the point of view that we really should be trying to find more people with more experiences in life. It should not be all journalism grads. And I think there's an openness to that. One of the best crime reporters I knew at the CBC was a criminal. He had a record. I don't think in 2024 we'd hire him. And in 2001, we did. He was great. He knew all the cops, knew everybody. Had good TV at a good price, but there was, but I think we need to be, what you're saying, I think we need to be, so if we hire all students from journalism schools, then we're gonna have a lot of similar people, right? Med schools, I mean, they have music students, right? It's not all biology students.
I do have one more question, but let's go to the audience. Any questions for our panel? Kathy, when are we done?
We're gonna get you a mic before you talk, but we're done in 35 minutes. All the students will be downstairs for class.
Okay.
So.
I have a question.
Of course you do. Sure, you use the mic and you can introduce yourself.
I am Dave Sorensen. I used to be a journalist back in the day. My first paycheck was $3.50 a week. But I'm not in that business now. I'm on the other side. But I'm actually curious about, I think that some big legacy media like Globe and Mail and New York Times do a great job of covering big issues. I think the problem is actually, and others pointed out, it's community media seems to be suffering yet. Catherine Welburn in Portsmouth Cove St. Phillips is doing a great job. Greg Westcott seems to be keeping his project going, which is always a good read. It's in the supermarket. I read it. What do you think they're doing that others aren't, that the Roys, for example, Port of Basque weren't doing?
They're writing about the people you know. Those people, like community news, municipal news, is the stuff that most directly affects your life often, and you're very connected to it. And I think there might be more of a willingness to pick that up off the shelf, or even in some cases pay for it, than provincial news. Unfortunately, people in Huron reading about the Northern Peninsula or something like that, but within their communities, and the communities you're talking about are still larger than most in the province, so it's still a problem. But one of the things we focus on is just constant shameless name dropping, because this is still a small province, and people read about the people they know, they're more engaged in it. And I think that is what those publications do well, amongst other things.
Do you ever find, ask you a challenging question, do you ever find you have to pull your punches?
No, you have to get used to people not liking you the next day sometimes, for sure. It's not an industry where everybody's going to be your friend later.
I'm just gonna chime in terms of smaller papers, the outlets, the startups that happened before. We used startup as a term to encourage new journalism outlets. But certainly what Catherine's doing and Craig, one of the benefits they have, as Alex mentioned, is a pure business consideration. When you have an audience that's large enough that you can make it work, then you can make it work. If you fail to engage with the same numbers under a broader area, and by that I'm thinking when you're talking about a comparison, why the laws went in a certain direction, that's a big piece of it. Like if they had financial support that was coming from the same kind of numbers that exist, say in just outside of town, or in Mount Pearl or CBS, then I think it would have been a very maybe different thought process for them. I can't really speak for them, but I'm thinking from a business perspective that it would have maybe been something to consider there. But the secondary piece of that is in full credit to anybody who's making a move with these kind of outlets, the folks who have survived with it. They've really done so by the skin of their teeth, by the sweat of their brow. Like, this is stuff where I know for a fact they put in endless hours. You know, they're not getting paid for endless hours, not even close, not even like a sniff of that. And they're putting in relentless work to keep those outlets alive and keep that very, you know, it might be a very small consideration for people to pick up a free copy of something off the corner of a supermarket stand, but if it connects you with local advertisers, those local advertisers think that they're connecting with you as a very targeted audience, that makes a massive difference to the survival of those things. So yeah, I would say, like, don't ever ignore the blood, sweat and tears aspect of it, I suppose.
I don't know much to add. It's personal passion, right? But if you're banking on personal passion, like Rec House, it's finite. It's my fear.
So many questions. Right here first.
Great panel so far, guys. My question is for Alex. Sorry? Oh, my name is John. I'm a 1-month student. My question is for Alex. I'm a huge fan of Newfoundland and Labrador. I think it's one of the most amazing. It's totally worth my money. I'm really like happy to pay it because the information I get there is something you can't find anywhere else. The amount of hours, the amount of work that goes into it is truly incredible. What worries me about Newfoundland and Labrador, as much as I love it personally, is that it's about 1,000 subscribers and 3,000 subscribers in Newfoundland and Labrador. And to me, and I might be maybe just prejudgmental about this, there are probably staffers of the Confederation building, business owners, business leaders, wealthier people that can, put aside that $40 a month. I know there's a multiple subscription plan, but I know a lot of businesses probably pay it. And at the end of the year, you can get a big tax rebate from the feds. So what worries me is that, and you have people like Andrew Parsons telling Patty on Open Line that, well, the premier gave an extensive interview to all Newfoundland and Labrador about this subject. So what are you complaining about? Are you worried that there's going to be an elitist element to news through this model, and that news will become something that only the privileged elite that are the power brokers have, the ability to see?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We just passed 3,000 last month, so I had to jump on that quickly. I don't have time to worry about that. It's a lot of hard work to do this. I think that is a fair worry, and maybe somebody should be worrying about it, but it's really hard to succeed in this industry, as we've been talking about all evening, and all we can do is produce the best product that we can. I can't just change to a different model and give it away for free. I think that we can sometimes be a little overzealous about the propriety of the stories. That's actually Anthony might be able to tell you, but it does often filter out there. We were the first ones to report of the bankruptcy protection for saltwire, and we've done stuff on the hydrogen industry that has gotten picked up elsewhere. And a lot of the stuff doesn't, but the big stuff tends to filter out, and the important stuff tends to filter out. So we contribute that way. There's an issue of access and privilege, sure, but one problem at a time, and just keeping the lights on and producing the content is hard enough.
Two more questions in the room.
I'm just gonna quickly chime in on that and say, part of that is I think too, it's throwing down the gauntlet for other outlets. Everybody has had their traditional way of approaching, how they produce reports and news, and maybe it's just a instigation to sort of have those other outlets rethink some of their approaches. Maybe they could assign a couple of reporters, solid, dedicated reporters, to do the kind of work that's being done at All Newfoundland from a business perspective. And that could be a supplement and not necessarily a threat, but a good one, I think, at the end of the day. I think that it provides great energy when you see success and rising subscription numbers, no matter where it's coming from.
And there's a fine line between niche and elitist, and they're successful. So as a journalist, I can't fault them much. And all you really need is a friend with a camera to take pictures of the desktop, which is the only way I can have access.
Can we cut that?
But in 5 days, like.
Hi, we've got a couple of questions online. I'm gonna combine Mike's. He's got one question. He says, local media has a problem. What is it doing to come together to deal with these common problems, such as maybe forming a co-op to deal with common issues? What are individual providers doing to enlist subscribers other than asking online? For example, are they showing up at large gatherings such as malls or food markets to sell their products?
Do you do any marketing? Like what kind of marketing do you do?
We have one ad at the airport.
That's.
I have to get Greg here to take a picture for it, to change it up next week.
But to point out, Greg, I said it's a really rare thing to see a photojournalist in the wild. They're a dying breed, and it's sad to say, but yeah.
Working together like that is difficult because we are competitive. We're competitive about stories. We have different business models. We have to answer often to owners and publishers. So that's a challenge. It's a field where, you can't have a regulator, right? So getting that kind of collective action doesn't really seem plausible. As for different ways of marketing your product and finding new subscribers, yeah, it's a great question. And probably other publications need to do more of that to survive.
It's interesting that you say that we're competitors, which we definitely are. And I would say privately non-funded, non-government funded news organizations are more competitive, but we do find ways, and I've always wondered why we don't do this more often, but an election campaign, which is very expensive. You get on the plane for the Liberals, you get on the plane for the Conservatives, the Winnebago with the NDP, whatever it is they're going to use, and you share camera resources, as opposed to, we used to send, every news organization would send their own crew. But if you're flying from St. John's to Goose Bay 4 times in a campaign, that starts to add up. So NTV and CBC, and I think, I can't speak for the other ones, but there is like a pool. And I've always wondered, well, if you can do it for election campaigns, especially as a publicly funded broadcaster, why can't you find other ways? If it's just the images, not the context, the fun part of journalism, but just the facts of shooting. Okay, Andrew Fury said this. I mean, does anybody care when a politician is at a podium, whether CBC shot it or Global shot or NTV shot it? The shooters do, because they want to get a good shot. But I think there are areas, and actually it happened recently with the budget. You know about this?
I don't want to say yes or no.
Well, the government wanted to have the media meet at a muster station and pull them through the protesters. And the media got together and said, that's a bad look for us. We're not covering your budget. I've never heard of this happening in any legislature or parliament. And the government bent and the whole thing was held off site. But I've never heard of a news organization says, hey, we're not going to cover your budget.
There are two North news organizations did go in, but they didn't have to go in through a police escort.
Who went? You?
A Canadian Press and some online publication.
Oh, okay, I didn't realize that.
There was just no open door. There was no passing protesters or getting police to guide us in. But there was a risk of that, not just a bad look, but a safety concern. And and it was interesting to band together like that to say, this is not really a good idea.
Must have had a lot of lousy sandwiches. Because that's usually.
On the banding together, I'm just gonna say that there's a lot of informal, that sort of a thing that happens informally. I don't know any of us that really hold firm to this idea of like, oh, I work for CBC, I can't even talk to the NTV people about that's ridiculous. There's just not enough of us to even make that in any way a sensible proposition. And there's so much work that's downloaded to each individual who is a reporter at this point in time that, at some point you have to start getting into the idea of, I don't understand this. And this might be the very first time this type of topic has ever been put in front of me. And I've got to produce something in the next 20 minutes. And I don't know if this comment that I just got is fit to eat. There's a very good chance that I'm going to text somebody that I know knows better than I do and say, look, I just got this thing. What do you make of it? That kind of stuff happens, but that happens from the reporter's job and the stuff that we're sort of focused on. I'm not in the daily world the way that I was. The work that I do now is more kind of trying to take all of the daily news reports and come to sort of a broader picture about it. That's magazine writing is very different kind of a style of reporting. And I think the biggest thing though is that we do have those conversations about our work. The difference is that we don't want to be in business. And I think that that's a big thing to underline, because all the times that I've been in audiences for these kind of talks, everybody's advice at the end of the day seems to be to have a startup or work together to make a co-op. The thing is, I don't want to be dedicating my time to dealing with the CRA on payroll issue. Like, I'm not a business owner. I don't want to run the business, but I do very much want to very aggressively go out and chase this particular story or this bit of information. And that's my focus and interest. And as for the idea of like sharing, the one hesitation I would say is that it's really important too to encourage, when we talk about a healthy media environment, not just a presence, but a bit of competition, a bit of multiple perspectives. So having more than one camera gives you more than one point of view. And sometimes it can be a very small thing, even in a podium situation where you manage to capture the story that might be behind the story. You know, maybe it's a little side conversation between a minister and a federal minister, or, you know, maybe it's a certain look on somebody in the audience as they're speaking. And just from that, you can kind of get an understanding of what you need to take away from this as a onlooker.
And yet I've seen, like with Canadian Press, for instance, I've seen competing news organizations publish the exact same Canadian Press story, right?
Oh, yeah, and
Wire
the
service.
wire service is, and again, it's the kind of thing that I don't think, I think some education in the sense of media education is probably a good idea if we're getting into civics. Media education is a part of that. The wire service is different from your individual outlets. We have one wire service reporter based in the province, works with the Canadian Press. There are folks who pop in from time to time who get hired freelance, and I should say, if there's anybody else out there that I'm not aware of that's working for a wire here, I'm sorry, but when they produce information, it goes on to a service that the other outlets buy into. So essentially you pay for access to what they're producing. So if I'm in Toronto, I can get a picture from St. John's, even though I don't staff somebody in St. John's all the time. That's part of the wire services purpose. And so that's why you see that replication.
I'd just like to quickly add that I certainly agree with that idea of inter-outlet camaraderie. And I think that's something that exists here, maybe more than other provinces, because I talk about it with, you know, our colleagues in other provinces. And I think we all communicate and get along, whether it's pooling ideas for questions or interview requests at the House, or, you know, somebody asking me a legal question or me asking Mike Connors a, you know, history or politics question. I think that might be better in Newfoundland than a lot of places.
Question on it.
This is passed, so I think this guy is.
I didn't break it. I'm glad that agencies came up, because, well, to put it perhaps more bluntly, there's a certain amount of public support available for journalism, and I would argue at great length necessary. If you are, however, the Telegram or more extreme, all the way from my Labrador, and the support that is given you helps only those people who can purchase your subscription or access it. Is that a good use of the support that's available? I personally, and it's not ideal, but I look to things like the Local Journalism Initiative, where journalists, not institutions, are given that support, and where what is provided is then made publicly available, like an agency, to all the publications. I would like it also to be made available directly to the public, but I'll take, you know, to all the organizations. To basically, I guess, if you're, Anthony aside, because CBC, but if you're an organization, a news organization, whose product is either narrowly focused or only available subscribers for both, should you be getting public resources, and how would you justify
I think public resources behind news is politically problematic, and it's not something we ever asked for, but we're not martyrs, you know. We'll take it. And so we certainly don't advocate for it. And this came up earlier today, and I suggested that, you know, specifically targeting that kind of public support brings a different kind of risk in terms of public buy-in and this idea of trust. So, you know, it's difficult, you know, there's two competing kind of challenges there. Actually, you wanna jump in on that? Yeah.
Throw me on the fire. I think I've made myself entirely unemployable through the course of this session. No, I think, I obviously advocate for, support for outlets. And mainly it's because I think that that's where the interest in the money is going to begin with. Like, I think we're building, the next world of media, of local reporting, on this idea of startups. And if we're gonna go roaring down that road, then, well, let's get all in. Because otherwise they won't survive. And then what are you left with? I mean, I just think it's you know, it's a conversation that has to be had, you know, people amongst themselves and what they lobby their representatives for, and that's gonna be an individual choice. But as a reporter, I can tell you that there's no new jobs that are coming in those big legacy media outlets that are serving you know, the real interests, the real needs in the same way that some of the folks that are dedicated in these smaller outlets are serving. I just think that you have to give these outlets a chance now. You know, if it ends up in a broad debate about, you know, whether we give cash to the rebel or not or something, you know, I don't know, whatever you're for or against, I don't know, but yeah, that's a conversation to have in the same way you would have a conversation about, you know, whether or not you deliver public funding to any particular initiative. But for me, 100%, I think if you are putting people on the ground where there's a complete absence of that effort to begin with, if you have people focused in areas where there are no eyes right now, then yeah, you can take $1 or $2 from my tax every year. I got no problem.
Just to be clear, I'm talking principally about publicly available versus you have to pay a subscription or something. It is not shareable.
Well, the big thing is historically, and this is one thing I would throw out, is that there's always been some degree of fragmentation, some degree of private media. And we haven't always had or ever had that entirely public area of exchange and communication, that not all reporting has been entirely free. But that's pre-existing today's date. I think right now it's just a little more acute and more noticed because of the declines and the absences that you see on the other side from the bigger legacy outlets. But yeah, that sort of, I mean, you still had to have a subscription to get the Telegram, technically speaking, right? And in a similar sense, you would have a subscription to get the Narwhal. Do I think that both outlets could potentially get support if we're going down that road further with federal funding? Yeah, I do. And I think if we're talking then at that point, who should maybe be more considered for the funding? Something like the Narwhal to me is of more interest when you're talking public funding than your legacy outlet.
Just a quick factoid to sort of support what Alex was saying. When I talked about the Oxford College and the Reuters Institute, part of the study of Canada, the two findings I think are interesting. This is a problem with any kind of funding, I think, for private news organizations. They looked at the undue influence on the news media, and the percentage who think the media are independent from political or government influence, 29%. It's in English Canada, Quebec's a little better, French Canada. The percentage who think media are independent from undue business or commercial influence, 27%. So at a time when I think we have, as I say, a party that's got a lot of momentum saying the CBC is a state broadcaster, and if you think that a lot of Canadians think that we're already gullible dupes of either government or business, the trust factor is a big one. So if you start giving him money, I mean, people have already written us off, but you know, if they start not a majority, but you know, there's some success in that, it's a problem, right? The old days when the Tide ad and the car dealership and the want ads paid for things are gone. And we talk about the crisis, which is where you started the whole thing. We haven't found a replacement that works yet. That's as simple as that.
I think though, and my counter to that would be, I think it's less of a problem right now than people maybe make it out to be. Because people are aware of that base conversation that says there's been this erosion in media and they are on the ropes and this is the base that we're starting from. Like, I think when you talk about, trust, the trust is not good to begin with, right? So you start to sort of counterweigh, like, could we maybe recover more trust if we start putting more resources and better reporting into the places where people are looking for it and asking for it and desperate for it? I think that's when you get to a place where, for me anyway, that's where how I get to a place that says, I'm okay with that funding. And it's because of that. It's because I think that issue is there regardless. And it's only gonna get worse. And at some point, everything will be set on fire. Somebody will rip off the public to a significant degree, and then everybody will say, well, gosh, we should have put more into some sort of oversight or check on public spending and the halls of power. And it wouldn't have been great if in that entire region, we had one reporter. That's where I'm at.
We have about 10 minutes left.
My fear with that though is, as with military bases, hospitals, which you could do, politicians always say this is science-based decision, which always is an alarm bell, but military bases, hospitals, I suspect if you allowed governments of any level to start deciding where they were going to partially fund a newspaper, political considerations would enter into it. We've got a squeaker on the Northern Peninsula. Let's start the Bugle. That'd be my fear, is that it'll be manipulated as all spending is.
The one thing I can say though, is that there's no military bases if there's no funding.
Fair enough, yeah.
We have about 10 minutes left, less than 10 minutes left. And a bunch of questions from a bunch of folks down here. So I think we'll do a series of questions and then a wrap up answers.
Sure.
You guys ready for the firing round? Okay.
Hello, thank you for this panel. I'm a grad student in political science, and my question is about social media and democratization. You said that individuals like reporting is not good, like on social media, like kind of behaving on behalf of reporting on behalf of journalists in different places. So, but I know that there are there's a group of other journalists, other people saying that it is like democratization of media, and it is like crowdsourced reporting journalism, and especially in developing countries, they think that they cannot reach the information. So if people are reporting on social media, it is good. So, but now you're saying here that it is not good, and it is kind of I'm just paraphrasing, but stealing your jobs. So, so what is like this? In one place, it is democratization of media, and in another place, it is stealing your jobs. And yeah, so what do you think about it? Thank you.
Over here.
I don't think it's stealing our jobs at all. And I don't think it's necessarily bad. I think there's a lot of value in it, which is one of the reasons these things are successful. There's a lot of risk and problems with it too. And it's just one more form of media that is not necessarily news media, and it's competition in its own right. It should be pushing us to do better. Okay, this is quick though, so I'll stop.
We're gonna go to another question, but we'll jump in on the not stealing our job.
Let me just say, a huge supporter for people who get out there and really dig for information. It's something that every single person, if they have a few hours, should be able to do. Yay, let's support them.
Okay, go.
On the broadcast side, we love the visuals. We love the visuals. The Baltimore situation, the first images to come and go instantly were from social media. So it's not that all social media is horrid. The problem is, how many social media accounts are there on the globe? And how do you decide which ones are actually fact checking and doing the context work? But you're right, journalists, we've been privileged. We love the gateway position we've had, and the world has changed, and we've got to figure out whether they still want gatekeepers in any capacity at all.
So a little column A, a little column B.
Yeah, I would just say it's a really different perspective if you're in the middle of a highly populated area or in the middle of a situation with a lot of eyes or a lot of people doing footage or photos or crowdsourcing that way is really interesting from a social media perspective. If you're in rural Newfoundland, you're the only person at the scene, it becomes a little more problematic.
You guys don't need to make your class on time, right?
All right, questions? Those, come on, we really do.
Thank you. My name is Jenna. I'm an undergraduate political science student. My question is with the crisis and the collapse of media, local media, how does that affect the checks and balances system for governance in the province? Often the government will frame something one way and the media is the check to reframe it into a way that is actually correct and transmitted truly. So how does that change?
Okay, wait. More questions than answers. More questions? Oh, anyone else?
I'm Beth Schwartz, I'm a professor of political science, and my question is sort of broader and not broader, but the question is, how does the narrowing and the fragmentation of media, which seems, as you're saying, help people to bring together all of the disparate things that are going on? And so I know that it's really important to have somebody on the scene at an event, and ideally more than one person, so you can have multiple perspectives on that, because there I push back against the we can find the truth, because I think that perspectives, like, not that there is no truth, but that there can be multiple truths. And that part of the journalist's job is to help us see those. But also, we have increasingly issues that need to be talked about together. So like the business and politics is one thing, but if you don't talk about childcare, or you don't talk about food insecurity, or you don't talk about environmental collapse, how do we see all of these things as connected when they fundamentally are? And so, yeah, it's just a really easy question for you.
Okay, I think that's it for one more question in the room and you can answer.
I'm a master's student. So you want me to get up because I didn't see your faces, so you want to see mine. So I'm more interested in the boring generalization and the theoretization stuff, unfortunately. I was talking to one of my professors last week, and we were bamboozled about the fact that some news about conflict, international news, are not popular at all, like Yemen, but some are just so popular that everybody is talking about it. So I have never been in a room with this many experienced journalists. So just wanted to push your question to maybe an answer about it, like what makes things more popular and what makes things unseen.
On the international side, and Greg might back me up on this, and I'll say something controversial. I think news organizations reflect the dominant culture of which they are part. And we expend more resources with wars that have a lot of white people. Africa in North America in our media organizations is virtually ignored. And there are a number of conflicts in Africa which almost never make the news unless something really horrific happens. So I think that the answer to that is an issue of cultural bias, and news organizations grapple with that. If you look at the resources in both Ukraine and the current situation in the Middle East, they receive a lot of resources, whereas these other conflicts, I mean, if we take a humanistic point of view where we think all life is important, we should do a much better job in places of the world that I'm embarrassed by that. We have resources to have a bureau in Africa, and we don't. That's what Canada does.
For those first two questions, I have only bad news, and that those checks and balances decrease. That's it. You know, there is fewer of them. As for fragmentation, Ashley talked about if we focus on these, and apologies, I don't paraphrase this accurately. If we focus on these certain areas and develop them well and find these niche markets and cover them well, then maybe within those trust rises. And if that's successful, maybe you start to raise that trust factor overall, but it's difficult. It's almost like going in one direction and hoping it fixes it the other way.
On the checks and balances, totally agree. The more you lose, the more those disappear. I think that's a given. And when it comes to international, part of the thing there is chasing the audience, and that's, I think, a failure of the older sort of models of journalism business, is that they served up to whatever they think both advertisers, but also readers, would really chase. People always say the Telegram on a localized level, because I don't report internationally, but at a localized level, people would always say, well, why do you run, these things about, car accidents? Well, phenomenally higher numbers, there's phenomenally greater interest in car accidents. Polar bears, puppies and babies. If you do nothing but run stories about polar bears, puppies and babies, we would be drowning in the money business. The reality is, it's to some degree, the business is going to sort of push into those areas that they think they'll gain more business from. And we don't do that consciously as reporters, but we may be assigned to do stories that we wouldn't otherwise do because of that. There was a third question, and I thought it was really kind of interesting.
Fragmentation.
Yeah, on the idea of fragmentation, to be very clear, we don't cheer that. Like, or at least I don't cheer that. I don't think, I hate it. It really drives me crazy that the Narwhal is one of the leading journalistic outlets in the country, because when they started out, they were going to be environmental only, and they still very much focus on the environment. And there's so many issues that really are too, I think, cross-pollinated to be that focused and still do real justice to some of those stories in those areas. They do fantastic work. Please, at some point, I may come running to you for a job, but I don't want to see that as much, but that's where the market is going. Like, that's where people are saying, okay, this is journalism. Whatever you're doing, that isn't journalism. And part of that is the trust issue, the decline and the interest in what people consider to be generic media, or they see things like all Newfoundland and Labrador and hear how they have so much more information about X or Y, Z topic. So that's where they're going to put their money, and they're not going to buy the Telegram subscription anymore. So as an individual reporter, I don't love it. But as somebody who follows the business, I see that that's where it's going, and it's sort of inevitable. So let's talk about how we're going to make that path work from a broader sort of community perspective, and find ways to make community spaces and spaces that everybody can kind of join in the conversation.
Just a quick answer to Jen about checks and balances. I think our news organizations and all of us comfort ourselves with covering the House of Assembly. And the low-hanging fruit of covering that place, we go to bed at night saying, oh, we were the watchdog and it's checks and balances. But back to Carl Bernstein, the real journalism still happens with face-to-face interviews with people. So you can't do a story about a gigantic hydro project on the Port-au-Port Peninsula without actually going there. You can't do a project about whether a certain aquaculture company is actually adhering to the environmental regulations without actually going there. So a lot of politics needs to be covered where the politics happens. Yes, the decisions are made up there, but the effect it has on the people and the parties that are interested, if you don't get the face-to-face stuff, and if you don't have, back to the old beat system, somebody who really loves covering politics and understands procedure and wants to cover it, it's weak. So as someone who loves politics, I'm really worried about that.
But I mean, I'd love to see somebody out there dedicated to education reporting, labor reporting, like, if we had somebody who was really steeped in that and knew not just the present day, but the history and the context, and on the fly could throw that into the conversation. I think that that's what you maybe benefit from if we're going to run down this road of more niche reporting, is potentially you establish jobs for people to do that kind of work. And maybe you lose out in other areas, but I think there's a
That's good.
potential
That's optimistic.
to do that.
I like that. We're all generalists now. Well, you're not, but most journalists, it's generalists, right? What am I an expert in today? Throw the dartboard. Okay, whales. Tomorrow, economics. There were huge advantages to the old beat system.
We lean quite heavily into the beat system. We've got an oil and gas reporter, we have a tech reporter, like even within business, really get people. We have a utilities reporter, which, Ashley is familiar with because she used to do that super exciting beat.
Oh, yes.
The one thing I'd quickly say is that one of the biggest losses, and I think that it should be acknowledged, from the change that we've had in the media in the last so many years, since I talk like I'm this big authority on all media ever. I'm not. I had a very tiny little space in history. The change, though, even in my time, is we've lost the mentorship in the newsrooms and the knowledge base in the newsrooms. So once upon a time, there was a system whereby if I came in as a junior reporter and something got thrown on my desk, yes, I'm a generalist, but right sitting next to me is the guy who covered this thing that was nothing but this topic for, 5 or 10 years, and it was a huge scandal, and he spent unending hours digging into the very tiniest, and he has some of that recall at his hand. That's a resource that's like gold, and physically speaking, the other flip side of that in terms of resources, all of these legacy media outlets, one of the things that they do have that as a public, I would encourage people to start maybe nudging them about. And again, I don't know what kind of trouble I'm gonna get in, but when newspapers close, they have these massive archives of photography, of text, information that maybe didn't land in news reports, but it's still very valid to the conversations for topics that reoccur here over and over and over. And it's phenomenal what I think could potentially be gleaned from, if you digitized old rolls of photos, what could you pull from those? Or even just the photos that existed when I worked at the Telegram, our search engine internally only went back to 1990. So if I wanted to know things before that, I would hike it over to the Arts and Culture Center. I would go to Memorial University and start ripping through microfiche and spend hours trying to find what happened on that day because it wasn't in a system somewhere. And I think that that's maybe an area too that we could really get interested in as a community, as a society.
Okay, I need to end it, but apparently they want to go to a class. So, thank you so much. This was really rich and I think we could go on for a while longer. This was great. If we could get an applause.
You're awesome.